Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jessica Devereaux in Baltimore. And welcome to part 2 of our conversation with our guest, David Mandel, to discuss the crisis in Ukraine. David is a professor of political science at the University of Quebec in Montreal, and he specializes in the countries of the former Soviet Union, specifically looking at labor. Thank you so much for joining us, David.
I'm glad to be here.
So, David, I want us to kind of understand the historical context of this recent civil war. What has been the economic and political relationship with Russia? What has Ukraine's relationship been like since their independence in 1991?
Well, so the eastern part of Ukraine, which is the more industrialized part, I mean, the Soviet Union was a highly integrated economy. There's been some, since independence, there was some move to try to detach Ukraine to some degree, but still the Donbass, the eastern Ukraine, and the northeastern south are still highly integrated, especially the machine building sectors with Russia. The east is more agrarian, it's mostly smaller towns, and so they don't have that same economic interest or tie.
Wait, so the West is more?
I mean, the West.
Okay.
Well, the West is. I mean, there's three regions. I mean, I forget how many provinces or regions there are, but there's quite a few. But there's three that are really the what should I say, the cradle of Russian nationalism, which is a very anti-Russian nationalism. And this was part of Ukraine that was separated from the rest of the country for hundreds of years and was only rejoined the rest of Ukraine in 1939 under Stalin. Actually, it was part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Treaty, and then the end of the war. It was occupied, and at the end of the war, it became part of the Soviet Union. So this part is obviously looks more to the West. It's extremely anti-Russian, hostile to Russia, and it also doesn't have much economically or in terms of family ties. Linguistic, not really much linguistically, ethnically. It's a different religion. It's the Greek Unity Church. There's in the East, it's the Russian Orthodox Church. So it doesn't have these same ties. And and I said its nationalism has a major part of its nationalism is hatred of Russia, and to some degree of Russians.
Was there ever talk of partitioning sections of Ukraine? I mean, was there ever that conversation that they should divide the country at all?
No, not really. But the eastern parts of Ukraine were, at the turn of the 20th century, started being built up as an industrial parts, coal mining, metallurgy, some machine building, and people, and it was basically, I wouldn't say unpopulated, but they were nomadic peoples. There were Cossacks there, who it's not clear if they're Russian or Ukrainian. Anyway, cities started being built, and people came from all over. But they were Russian. These towns are Russian-speaking. Generally, in Ukraine, the cities are Russian-speaking. So that, and it wasn't really considered part of Ukraine at the time. It was called Small Russia, Mala Russia. Then, after the Civil War, though, in 1920, the communist government decided to make this part of Ukraine. So even this part became part of Ukraine only since 1920, really. And local communist elements are actually opposed that to some degree, but they were overruled. And then they have the western regions, the three western regions, which were joined to Ukraine only in 1939, 1939, in the 1940s. So you see, and the state, Ukraine as a state, never really existed before. I mean, there was maybe a few months during the Civil War in Russia. So it first came into existence in 1991, and so it's extremely fragile. And you think this kind of state, the political elites would be very concerned about keeping it together and creating a national identity, and making everyone feel at home. But what there's been since 1991 is a kind of tug-of-war. The Western province wanting to impose their culture and their orientation, anti-Russian orientation, on the rest. Of course, this is anathema to the East, and then the East. This last government that was overthrown was more identified with the East, and it was overthrown in what people in the East see as a kind of Western-sponsored coup d'état, and they see it as illegitimate. So this is what's been going on, and I'd say that, and so the political elites, which have been basically at the service of the so-called oligarchs, which is the new capitalist class, it's a small class but extremely rich, has basically pillaged the country for the last two plus decades. They've been making instead of trying to calm down these nationalist passions and these different linguistic and ethnic differences, have been actually exacerbating them to gain political advantage when in their intra-elite struggles and to gain elections, etc. And that's it. Yeah.
So, David, you've been involved in labor education in Ukraine for many years. So, for you, what are the issues faced by the Ukrainian working class? You mentioned that elite that has kind of risen to power, these oligarchs. Can you speak to that a little bit? And what are the concerns of the working people?
Well, that's just it. This kind of a, yeah, it's kind of even it's kind of a postmodern identity struggle, although there are economic interests somewhere involved. But basically, it keeps the working people, and mass of the population are very poor in Ukraine. Most are really members of the working class in terms of people that work for a salary. There's almost no social safety net in Ukraine. It's in this way, it's much worse. I mean, you get sick in Ukraine, you pay for everything. You pay for the sheets, you pay for the food, you pay for the soap that cleans the floor. You get nothing. You pay for the doctor, you pay for the medicine, you pay for the blood transfusion. So there's really no social safety net. And this is the mass of the population. But instead of, and then there's a ruling group, a small ruling, the oligarchs, so-called oligarchs. It's a big capital, who basically just pillaged the country, and got for pennies, got the factories and all the wealth that was inherited from the Soviet Union, and created very little. You have this group that keeps the population divided along these ethnic and linguistic lines, so they can't get together to fight the corruption. The corruption is just horrible in Ukraine, and that's the real. I mean, for me, the real issue is to overcome this communitarian strife, so that you can get really down to social and economic issues, and fight corruption, and get control over the economy so that it can start developing. I mean, Ukraine is one of the, I think it's the one of two, or maybe the only one of the former Soviet republics that hasn't yet reached the level of GDP per capita that it was in 1991 when Soviet Union fell apart.
So for you then, does it mean that being in this sphere of influence, that just to kind of borrow the language of geopolitics, of either Russia or Europe, would either one really benefit the conditions of workers? Do you have a stance on that?
Should be. I mean, it's just from a purely rational point of view, Ukraine, the most advantageous position for Ukraine is to be neutral, and then to be between East and West, Russia and the European Union, and to as much as possible play one against the other. And I think that's something that Russia would definitely accept. I mean, it's probably not Putin's first choice, but the West is insisting that Ukraine become part of being drawn into the Western camp in a kind of, and Russia sees this really a hostile move. I mean, there was a declaration in 2008 that the intention of NATO is to bring eventually Ukraine in. I mean, how real that is another question. And then this government, the prime minister, the government now said it's going to apply for NATO membership. I mean, I don't think it'll get in, but that's beside the point. But I mean, you have to, from Russia's point of view, what's been happening since Soviet Union fell apart is that NATO has been advancing, incorporating the country, advancing toward the east, incorporating countries that are getting closer and closer to Russia's border. And Russia views this as basically, I mean, it's a hostile policy aimed at containing Russia, and limiting any kind of influence it has within its own borders, and surrounding with hostile states. And if you know anything of the Russian history of the first half of the 20th century, you can understand how sensitive Russia would be. And Ukraine is the big prize, because it's 2,500 kilometers of a common border with Russia. I mean, it's bordering on the part of Russia where all the population and the great part of the industry is. Ukraine has deep historical, ethnic, family, linguistic, and other ties. You know, the West has just been totally indifferent to that, you know, insensitive to that. And that's the basic source of the problem. Trouble, I think, if the West were not supporting to the hilt the Ukrainian, the nationalist faction, the Ukrainian elite, we wouldn't have seen the civil war. So the West bears a lot of responsibility.
All right, David Mandel, thank you for joining us.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.